You don't live here anymore. That was it. No, welcome home, Isabella. No, we missed you. No hug after I had just spent the last 8 months sweating in the blistering, unforgiving heat of Qatar on my fourth overseas deployment. There was just my father, Victor, standing at the end of my driveway in San Diego with his arms firmly crossed, physically blocking my path to the front door of my own home. That I froze completely, one hand gripping the thick canvas handle of my heavy military duffel bag, the other holding my backpack strap. The taxi driver who had just dropped me off from the airport was already pulling away, the sound of his engine fading down the quiet, upscale, coastal street. The California sun was bright, the ocean breeze was hitting my face exactly like I had imagined it would for the past 240 days, but the reality of the moment felt like a violent physical blow to the stomach. "Excuse me," I asked, honestly thinking I had misheard him. The jet lag from the endless flights across multiple time zones was heavy, and my brain was struggling to process the scene unfolding in front of me. Beside my father stood my older brother, Dominic. He was 42 years old, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other, completely unable to look me in the eye at first. Then a nervous, almost defensive smirk crept onto his face. Dominic had always been the golden child, despite being a walking disaster for the past 2 decades. While I had spent 15 long years building a career as a United States Air Force officer, surviving dangerous and exhausting missions in the Middle East, Dominic had spent his life bouncing from one get-rich-quick scheme to another. He left a constant trail of debts, broken promises, and unpaid loans, specifically gambling debts. "Dad's right, Izzy," Dominic chimed in, stepping out from behind my father's shadow to stand next to him. "You can't go inside. The house is gone." "Gone." I dropped my duffel bag onto the concrete driveway. It hit the ground with a heavy, final thud. "What the hell are you talking about, Dominic? This is my house. I bought it. My name is on the deed." My father finally uncrossed his arms. He looked older and much weaker than when I had left 8 months ago, but his eyes held that same stubborn, irrational defiance he always used whenever he was protecting his son. "It was sold, Isabella, 48 hours ago. The deal is completely finalized. You don't own this property anymore." I stared at him, my mind spinning out of control. "Sold? How could you sell a house that doesn't belong to you? I didn't sign anything. I've been in a combat zone." "We took care of it," Dominic said quickly, rubbing the back of his neck, a telltale sign that he was lying or hiding something massive. "Dad had the power of attorney. We had to move fast. It was an absolute emergency. I never gave you power of attorney to sell my real estate." I shouted, the deep exhaustion of travel completely vanishing, replaced instantly by a massive surge of pure, burning adrenaline. "I gave Dad limited power of attorney to handle my car registration and simple banking if something happened to me while I was deployed, not to sell my damn house." Victor took a step forward, raising his hands palms out, as if trying to calm down a wild animal. "Isabella, keep your voice down. The neighbors are going to hear you. We can explain everything inside. Well, somewhere else, but you need to understand right now that we had no other choice. Your brother was in deep trouble. Real trouble this time. I had to do what a father has to do to save his family. Save his family." I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that actually scraped my throat. "I am your family, too. You sold my home while I was overseas serving my country, just to pay off his gambling debts." For 8 months in Qatar, the only thing that kept me sane was the thought of this exact house. The coastal breeze of San Diego, the way the morning light hit the hardwood floors in the living room. The quiet sanctuary I had bought entirely on my own using my hard-earned VA loan. It wasn't just a building. It was my proof that I had built something solid out of a chaotic life. I had risked my life, missed holidays, birthdays, and normal life events just to afford this piece of peace. And now, my own blood had sold it out from under me. "It's more complicated than that," Dominic muttered defensively. You don't understand the people I was dealing with. They weren't going to just let it go. I don't care about your bookies or your loan sharks, Dom. I shoved past him, heading straight up the walkway for the front door. I needed to get inside. I needed to see my things to figure out what the hell was actually happening in reality. Izzy, wait. You can't go up there. Dominic yelled, reaching out and grabbing my arm tightly that I spun around, my military muscle memory kicking in instantly, and shoved him hard in the center of his chest. He stumbled backward awkwardly, tripping over the edge of the perfectly manicured lawn. Don't ever touch me, I warned him, my voice dropping to a dangerous, flat whisper. I am going inside my house. I reached the front porch and quickly pulled my keychain out of my uniform pocket. I jammed the familiar brass key into the deadbolt lock. It wouldn't turn. It didn't even slide in all the way. I tried the bottom handle lock. Nothing fit. They had completely changed the locks. Cold panic started to claw at the edges of my mind. Where is my stuff? I demanded, turning back around to face the two men standing at the bottom of the porch stairs. Where is my furniture? My clothes? Everything I own? It's safe, my father said, refusing to look even slightly apologetic. We rented a storage unit on the east side of town. We packed everything up carefully over the weekend. I paid for the first 3 months of storage out of my own pocket. You have plenty of time to figure out your next steps and find an apartment. Out of your own pocket. I repeated, completely disgusted by his wording. You sold a house worth nearly $1 million in a prime San Diego neighborhood, and you want a medal for paying $300 for a cheap storage unit. Before Victor could answer, the heavy wooden front door clicked open right behind me. I spun around instinctively. Standing in the doorway was a woman I had never seen before in my life. She looked to be in her late 30s, dressed casually in a comfortable, oversized sweater and jeans, holding a steaming mug of coffee. She looked just as confused as I was. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes darting nervously from me in my full military uniform down to my father and brother standing in the driveway. "Victor? Dominic? Is everything okay out here?" I felt all the blood drain rapidly from my face. "Who are you?" The woman blinked, taking a cautious half-step back into the hallway. "I'm Claire Whitmore. I just bought this house. I moved in yesterday afternoon. Who are you?" My father rushed up the concrete walkway, trying desperately to get between me and the open door. "Claire, I am so incredibly sorry for the disturbance. This is my daughter, Isabella. She just got back from overseas today. There was a little miscommunication about the timeline of the sale and her arrival. We were just leaving right now." "We are absolutely not leaving," I snapped, planting my boots firmly on the porch and standing my ground. I looked Claire dead in the eye, ignoring my father entirely. "Claire, I don't know what these two men told you, but my name is Isabella Reyes. I am the sole legal owner of this property. I did not authorize a sale. I didn't sign a single piece of paper. This is my home." Claire's face went completely pale. The coffee mug in her hand trembled slightly, spilling a few drops onto the welcome mat. "What? No, that's impossible. We went through a legitimate title company. The realtor handled everything. Arthur Blake. He assured me everything was perfectly legal and ready to go." Hearing that specific name made my stomach churn violently. Arthur Blake. He was a local real estate broker with a notorious reputation for playing extremely fast and loose with the rules. If my father and brother had teamed up with Arthur to execute this, it wasn't just a desperate, sloppy mistake. It was a calculated, highly orchestrated financial crime. "Claire," I said, forcing myself to keep my voice steady and reasonable despite the absolute rage boiling inside me. "I promise you, I will not let you become collateral damage in whatever scam they are running right now. But you need to know immediately that the transaction you just completed was completely fraudulent." "Isabella, stop this nonsense right now," my father barked loudly, grabbing my elbow and trying to pull me away from the door. You are scaring her. The deal is done. The money is gone. You cannot undo this. We will figure out a way to pay you back eventually, but you need to accept reality and walk away today." I violently yanked my arm out of his grip. I looked at this man, the man who had raised me, the man who had instilled in me the core values of duty and honor, the man who had just stolen my entire financial life to bail out his deadbeat son. He honestly thought because I was strong, because I survived war zones, that I would just take this hit. He thought I would pack up my bags, walk away quietly, and let Dominic ruin my life the exact same way he had ruined his own. That he was so incredibly wrong. I stood firmly on the front porch, the coastal breeze suddenly feeling freezing against my skin despite the bright California sun. Claire was trembling, holding her half-empty coffee mug against her chest like a physical shield. My dad was breathing heavily, his face flushed with a toxic mix of frustration, embarrassment, and guilt. Dominic was staring at his shoes again, fully reverting to the cowardly boy he had always been whenever he got caught breaking the rules. They all expected me to scream, to cry, or to just turn around and walk away to process the shock. But I wasn't actually in shock. I didn't just stumble blindly into this ambush today. I already knew they were up to something sickening. Even if seeing strangers in my house was still a massive punch to the gut, this entire nightmare had actually started exactly 3 weeks ago, while I was still stationed in Qatar. I vividly remember sitting in my cramped, air-conditioned quarters after a brutal 14-hour shift on the flight line. My uniform was soaked in sweat, my muscles were screaming for rest, and I was desperately counting down the days until I could come back to this exact house. I picked up my phone to check my emails, and sitting right at the top of my inbox was an automated high-priority alert from my bank regarding my mortgage, specifically warning me about an unusual property transfer inquiry debt and why heart rate had spiked instantly. I didn't wait a single second. I dialed my father's number right then and there. When he finally answered, he sounded incredibly nervous, his voice shaky and completely out of character. When I pressed him about the bank alert, he aggressively avoided the topic, stammering out some pathetic, nonsensical excuse about just checking on property tax rates before abruptly rushing off the phone. My gut, trained by years of military service to recognize danger, told me he was lying through his teeth. I immediately called Dominic next. He picked up, but the exact second I mentioned the house and the bank email, he just hung up the phone on me without saying a single word that I didn't let it go. You don't survive 15 years of dangerous deployments by ignoring massive red flags. I quietly walked straight over to the base JAG office and sat down with a military lawyer. I explained the situation, and we spent hours legally pulling up the San Diego County land records and title histories through their secure databases. What the lawyer eventually showed me on his computer screen made my blood run absolutely cold. My father had actively submitted 3 separate legal documents to the county clerk to initiate the sale of my home, and every single one of those documents featured my electronic signature, which he had completely forged. The JAG officer had looked me dead in the eye and warned me that because I had purchased this property using a military VA loan, this was no longer just a messy family dispute. There were massive, undeniable signs of federal document forgery. I snapped back to the present moment on the porch. I looked right at my father, who was still trying to act like he was the authority figure in this situation. "You honestly think I'm finding out about this for the first time right now, Dad?" I asked him, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous level that made him flinch. Victor blinked, his defensive posture faltering for a split second. "What are you talking about, Isabella? I knew you were doing something 3 weeks ago," I told him, watching the remaining color completely drain from his wrinkled face. "I saw the bank alerts. I saw the land records. I know exactly what you did with those 3 documents, Dad. I know you forged my electronic signature while I was sitting in a combat zone." Claire gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her free hand. "Forged? Oh my God." Arthur told me the seller was deployed and had legally signed off on everything digitally. He showed me the paperwork. Arthur Blake is a known scam artist, and my family used him to steal my property I said to Claire, never taking my eyes off my father. Did you really think you could get away with this? Did you think I wouldn't check? It's a VA loan, Dad. That is a federal loan. You didn't just steal from your daughter. You committed a massive federal crime. Dominic suddenly cracked. The pressure was entirely too much for him, as it always was. He took a step forward, his hands shaking violently as he looked at me with wild, terrified eyes. We had to do it, Izzy. Dominic yelled, his voice cracking with pure panic. You don't understand what was happening. I wasn't just dealing with a regular bank or a normal bookie this time. I owe massive amounts of money to an underground gambling ring, and they are directly linked to organized crime. I stared at my older brother in absolute disgust. Organized crime? Are you out of your mind, Dominic? They were going to kill me, he screamed, tears actually forming in the corners of his eyes. They gave me a deadline. If I didn't pay them back in full by the end of the month, they told me I was going to be handled. Handled? I repeated the word slowly, letting the pathetic reality of his situation hang in the air between us. So, because you couldn't stop placing bets, because you got in bed with the mafia, my house gets sold. Victor pushed Dominic slightly behind him, stepping up to take the heat. He was shaking now, too, his tough guy facade completely crumbling under the weight of the truth being dragged out into the daylight. Isabella, please listen to me. I was terrified. These people came to my house. They threatened your brother's life right in front of me. I had to sell your house within 72 hours just to get the cash to save his life. You sold my home in 3 days. I asked, feeling a new wave of nausea hit my stomach. A house in this neighborhood should have taken months to close properly. A 72-hour fire sale meant they had completely dumped the property for pennies on the dollar just to get fast liquid cash. We used Arthur Blake because he knew how to push the paperwork through quietly and quickly without asking questions, Victor admitted, his voice breaking. He found Claire. She made an all-cash offer. We closed the deal. The money went straight to the people Dominic owed. I saved your brother's life, Isabella. What else was I supposed to do? Let them murder my son. You were supposed to be a father to both of us, I shouted, finally letting my anger break through my military discipline. You don't get to play God with my life to fix his mistakes. You stole my house. You forged federal documents. You involved this innocent woman in a massive illegal real estate scam. And you think you're the hero of this story. Claire was crying now, leaning heavily against the doorframe. I put my entire life savings into this house, she whispered, her voice trembling. I just wanted a fresh start. Arthur told me it was a clean, totally legal sale. What happens to me now? I don't know yet, Claire, I answered honestly, feeling a sharp pang of sympathy for her. She was just a pawn in my family's disgusting game. But I promise you, I am not walking away from this. I am getting my house back. I pulled my phone out of my uniform pocket. I didn't have to think about my next move. I had already planned for this exact scenario on the long flight back from the Middle East. Who are you calling? Victor asked, his eyes darting to my phone. Isabella, put that away. We can settle this privately. I'll get a second job. Dominic will work. We will pay you back every single cent over time. Just please, don't make this any worse than it already is. I looked at the two men who shared my blood. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a bank account, an asset they could liquidate to clean up their own messes because they assumed I was strong enough to just rebuild my life from scratch. It's already as bad as it can possibly get, I said, dialing the number. Because I'm not calling a family therapist, Dad. I'm calling the police. 911, what is your emergency? I kept my eyes locked entirely on my father as I answered the calm voice of the dispatcher. My name is Captain Isabella Reyes, United States Air Force. I am reporting a massive case of identity theft, federal document forgery, and real estate fraud at my current location. Victor's face went from pale to a sickly, grayish ash. He actually lunged forward, reaching out to snatch the phone directly out of my hand. But my military reflexes were far too quick. I stepped back smoothly, easily dodging his desperate, clumsy grasp. "If you touch me again, Dad, I will add physical assault to the list of criminal charges," I warned him, my voice completely devoid of any daughterly affection. I was speaking to a cornered criminal now, not my father. Down on the driveway, Dominic was pacing violently in tight, erratic circles, pulling hard at his own hair. "You can't do this, Izzy. You're going to get me killed. If the cops start looking into those accounts, the people I owe money to will find out. They will literally end me." I completely ignored his pathetic whining and gave the 911 dispatcher my exact address. I explained clearly and concisely that I was the legal homeowner, that I had just returned from a combat deployment in the Middle East, and that unauthorized individuals had fraudulently sold my property behind my back. Because I specifically mentioned federal VA loan fraud, the dispatcher promised to send patrol officers immediately. Claire, the innocent and now devastated buyer, was still standing perfectly still in the doorway. She hadn't run back inside to pack her things. She just stood there in shock, clutching her half-empty coffee mug against her chest, crying silently. "I gave Arthur a cashier's check for $850,000, she whispered, her voice cracking with pure despair. "That was all my savings. Everything I got from my divorce settlement. He told me he was putting it directly into a secure escrow account. Claire, I am so incredibly sorry that you are caught in the middle of this," I told her, softening my tone just for her because she was a victim too. "But Arthur Blake didn't put your money into a standard escrow account. My military lawyer and I tracked the routing numbers attached to the fraudulent sale documents 3 days ago." I turned back to my father, who was staring at me in pure, unadulterated horror. "You didn't just pay off a neighborhood bookie, Dad. I saw the financial trace. The money from the house sale didn't go into your bank account, and it didn't go straight to Dominic's debt. It was transferred rapidly through multiple offshore and shell accounts. That is textbook money laundering." Victor shook his head violently, denying the reality staring him in the face. No, that's absolutely not true. Arthur told me he had to route the funds specially to avoid massive tax hits for you while you were deployed overseas. He looked me in the eye and said he was protecting your financial interests. He was protecting himself. I snapped back, disgusted by how easily he had been played. Arthur Blake used you. He knew you were desperate to save Dominic. He used your panic to facilitate a massive money laundering operation using my federal VA loan property as the clean asset. And you were stupid enough to forge my name to let him do it. Sirens began to wail loudly in the distance, growing sharper and closer as they approached our quiet coastal neighborhood. 2 San Diego Police Department cruisers aggressively turned the corner and sped down the street, parking at sharp angles to completely block my driveway. 4 armed officers stepped out quickly, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts as they assessed the highly unusual scene. A woman in full military camouflage, an elderly man looking like he was about to suffer a heart attack, a middle-aged man pacing like a trapped rat, and a crying civilian woman on the porch. I stepped forward immediately, keeping my hands perfectly visible and empty, and presented my military ID card and my California driver's license. "Officers, I am the legal homeowner of this property. These 2 men, my father and my brother, illegally sold my house while I was deployed in Qatar." The lead officer, a tall man with graying temples and a stern expression, frowned deeply as he looked at my IDs and then up at the large house. "Ma'am, real estate disputes are usually civil matters. We can't just arrest someone because of a messy family argument over a deed. You need to take this to a civil court." "It's not a civil dispute, officer," I corrected him firmly, refusing to be brushed off. "It's federal fraud. I purchased this home with a VA loan. They forged my electronic signatures on federal documents to force a 72-hour cash sale. I have already reported this to the JAG office at my military base, and they are currently preparing a brief for federal investigators." I need an official police report filed right now to establish the exact timeline of the crime. Hearing the specific words federal fraud and VA loan completely shifted the officer's demeanor. This wasn't a simple, annoying neighborhood misunderstanding over a will or a shared title. This was a major, high-level felony unfolding right in front of them. The officers immediately separated all of us to prevent us from coordinating our stories. They pulled Victor aggressively to the public sidewalk, walked Dominic over to the back of a police cruiser, and kept Claire and me up on the porch. Claire, shaking like a leaf in the wind, went inside for a brief second and brought out her closing paperwork to hand to the officer. Every single page had Arthur Blake's real estate agency logo plastered prominently across the top. I tried calling Arthur 10 minutes ago when she first showed up and started shouting. Claire told the officer, wiping her mascara-stained eyes. It went straight to his voicemail. I tried his main office number next, and his receptionist said he hasn't been in the building since yesterday morning. I looked directly at the investigating officer. Arthur Blake is running. He pushed this illegal sale through in 3 days, took his massive cut of the laundered cash, and now he is completely off the grid. The officer quickly keyed his shoulder radio, requesting an immediate background check on Arthur Blake and his brokerage firm. Within minutes, the dispatcher came back with a laundry list of previous formal complaints, suspended real estate licenses in 2 other states, and long-standing suspicions of shady dealings. Arthur Blake had officially disappeared, effectively going on the run and sparking an active police search that would intensely last for the next 2 days. Meanwhile, down by the street, Dominic was completely falling apart leaning against the police cruiser. Another officer was asking him very basic, standard questions about the financial transaction, and Dominic was sweating heavily through his shirt. His eyes were darting wildly up and down the quiet street, as if a mafia hitman was aiming a sniper rifle right at his head from the neighbor's roof. I didn't forge anything. Dominic yelled out suddenly, his voice cracking and echoing loudly across the neighborhood. My dad did the digital signatures. I just needed the money. You don't understand. The guys I owe, they aren't going to care that the cops are involved now. They are going to kill me. They know where I live. He was practically confessing to financial conspiracy and openly admitting his direct ties to an underground criminal syndicate right in front of sworn law enforcement. The immense psychological pressure from the ruthless creditors was completely breaking his mind. He simply couldn't handle the crushing reality of his own actions collapsing on top of him. Victor stood on the sidewalk, watching his golden sun actively melting down, and tears finally spilled down his wrinkled cheeks. He looked past the officers directly at me, his eyes begging for mercy, silently pleading with me to call it all off. He wanted me to tell the police it was just a big family mistake, so he could go over and comfort his 42-year-old boy. I just stared back at him with absolute, unwavering coldness. I wasn't going to save them this time. I filed the formal report directly with the police right then and there, officially launching the criminal investigation that would bring the heavy weight of federal agencies down on my own family. The police officers didn't pull out handcuffs right away, but the shift in their authority was absolute. They had separated everyone completely now, treating my father and brother not as annoying neighbors in a civil dispute, but as active suspects in a major federal fraud investigation. The lead officer, the one with the graying temples, walked back up to the porch where I was standing with Claire. He looked at both of us, but his focus was entirely on me and the military identification I still held in my hand. Captain Reyes, we are taking your father and your brother down to the precinct for formal questioning, the officer explained, his voice flat and professional. Given the fact that this involves forged digital signatures on federal VA loan documents, we are also heavily coordinating with federal authorities and the military JAG office you mentioned earlier. This is completely out of the realm of local property disputes now. They will likely be held while we sort out the immediate paper trail, especially since the real estate broker, Arthur Blake, is currently missing and actively evading our calls. I nodded slowly, absorbing the reality of his words. I had spent 15 years serving my country, following the rules and building a life of integrity, and now I was watching my own family being treated like common criminals. But I didn't feel a shred of pity for them. They had brought every single ounce of this disaster upon themselves by choosing to steal my home. Claire let out a long, shaky breath beside me. "What do I do?" she asked the officer, her voice barely a whisper. "All my money is tied up in that fraudulent escrow account. I have my furniture inside. Where am I supposed to sleep tonight?" The officer softened his tone slightly when addressing her. "Ma'am, technically, because the sale was initiated through federal wire fraud and forged documents, the transaction is completely void. You don't legally own this house. However, because this is an unprecedented situation and it's getting late, I am not going to physically force you out onto the street tonight. But you need to contact a lawyer immediately tomorrow morning. You are a victim of a massive financial scam, and you need legal representation to track down your funds and handle your exit from this property." Claire nodded numbly, wiping a fresh tear from her cheek. I looked at her and felt a genuine wave of sadness. She was just a woman trying to start over, completely blindsided by my family's toxic, chaotic mess. Down on the street, another officer was patting down Dominic before placing him in the back of the patrol cruiser. Dominic wasn't resisting, but he was visibly shaking, muttering frantically under his breath about the people he owed money to and how they were going to find him in jail. His severe gambling addiction and deep ties to an underground syndicate had finally caught up with him, and the psychological pressure was completely breaking his mind right there on the sidewalk. Then I looked at my father. Victor was standing near the second police car, talking aggressively to one of the officers. When he saw me looking at him, he suddenly pushed past the cop, ignoring the stern warnings to stay put, and marched directly toward the bottom of the porch stairs. The officers let him get a few feet away from me before stepping in to block his path, clearly recognizing that he wasn't a physical threat to me, just a desperate, cornered old man trying to manipulate his way out of a corner. "Isabella, please," Victor begged, his voice cracking loudly. The tough, authoritative father figure who had greeted me with crossed arms just an hour ago was completely gone. He looked frail, pathetic, and terrified. "You have to tell them to stop this. You have to call your military lawyers and tell them we reached a family agreement. If they take this to a federal level, I am going to prison. Do you understand me? I will die in a federal prison." I walked slowly down the porch steps until I was standing just a few feet away from him, separated only by a cautious police officer. I looked directly into his eyes, searching for any sign of genuine remorse for what he had done to me. I found absolutely nothing but selfish, raw fear. "You should have thought about federal prison before you forged my electronic signature on a VA loan document while I was deployed in a combat zone," I told him, my voice dangerously calm and steady. "You committed a felony, Dad. You didn't just make a mistake. You planned this. You executed it. You used a corrupt broker to launder the money through offshore accounts just to cover Dominic's tracks. You did all of that knowing exactly what it would do to me." Victor shook his head violently, tears finally spilling down his deeply wrinkled face. He reached out a trembling hand toward me, though the officer quickly swatted it down. "I didn't want to hurt you, Izzy. I swear to God, I didn't want to ruin your life. But you have to understand my position. I was completely out of time." He paused, taking a ragged, heavy breath, and finally confessed the twisted, sickening logic that had driven him to betray his own daughter. "I always thought you were strong enough to handle it," Victor cried out, his voice echoing down the quiet, upscale street. "Look at you, Isabella. You are a military officer. You survived deployments in the Middle East. You have a massive pension, a great salary, and you always figure things out. You are unbreakable. But your brother, Dominic, is weak. He has always been weak. The people he owed money to were going to literally put a bullet in his head by the end of the week. I was terrified of losing my son, so I made a terrible choice. I knew you could survive losing a house, but Dominic couldn't survive his debt. I thought you would be angry, but I thought you would eventually understand that I had to save his life." The absolute audacity of his confession hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't apologizing for stealing from me. He was actively trying to justify his crime by weaponizing my own strength and independence against me. Because I had spent my entire adult life working hard, being responsible, and building a secure future, he believed I was the perfect target to absorb the brutal consequences of Dominic's pathetic, criminal failures. He thought my resilience gave him a free pass to destroy my sanctuary. I stared at him for a long, heavy moment. The California sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the driveway. The neighborhood was dead silent, save for the low hum of the police cruiser engines. "You didn't choose him," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet air with absolute, unforgiving clarity. "You chose to sacrifice me." Victor physically recoiled as if I had just slapped him across the face. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The harsh, undeniable truth of my statement completely shattered his delusion that he was a protective father making a tough call. He wasn't a hero saving his son. He was a coward who threw his loyal daughter directly under the bus because it was the easiest way out. For the first time in his entire life, my father completely broke down. He collapsed to his knees right there on the concrete driveway, sobbing loudly, burying his face in his trembling hands. The crushing realization that he was entirely responsible for his own destruction, that he was facing severe federal criminal charges and potential prison time, finally overwhelmed him. He had lost his daughter, he had failed to permanently save his son, and he had thrown his own freedom away for absolutely nothing. The police officers didn't wait any longer. They stepped forward, grabbed Victor firmly by the arms, and pulled him up from the concrete. They walked him toward the second patrol car, his legs dragging slightly as he continued to sob uncontrollably. I didn't blink. I didn't turn away. I stood perfectly still on my driveway and watched as they pushed my father into the back of the police cruiser, right behind my brother. The doors slammed shut with a heavy, metallic finality. As the patrol cars slowly pulled away from my house, their red and blue lights flashing silently in the fading evening light, I finally took a deep breath. The immediate confrontation was over, but the massive, chaotic legal war to reclaim my life, my finances, and my home was just beginning. I turned around and walked back up the stairs toward Claire, ready to figure out the next steps of this absolute nightmare. The police cars disappeared around the corner, their flashing lights completely fading into the quiet coastal night. I was left standing alone on my own driveway with a woman I had met exactly 1 hour ago. Claire was sitting on the top step of the porch, her head buried in her hands, crying so hard her shoulders were actually shaking. I was running on 0 sleep, massive jet lag, and pure adrenaline after 240 days in a Middle Eastern combat zone. But I couldn't just leave her sitting there in the dark. "Claire," I said, walking up the concrete steps and standing a few feet away from her. "Look at me." She lifted her head, her face blotchy and pale under the porch light. "I have absolutely nothing," she whispered, her voice completely broken. "I gave Arthur a cashier's check for my entire life savings. It's completely gone. I don't even have money for a hotel room tonight." "You're not going to a hotel tonight," I told her directly, keeping my voice calm and authoritative. "You have your furniture in there. Your bed is already set up. Go inside, lock the doors, and try to get some sleep. The police said they aren't physically kicking you out tonight, and neither am I. I have a military base 10 miles from here. I can get a secure room at the base lodging facility for the night." She looked at me like I had 2 heads. "You're letting me stay in your house? After everything your family just did?" "You didn't do this to me," I replied, keeping my emotions completely locked down. "My father and my brother did. You are just the innocent person they used to get fast liquid cash. But tomorrow morning, at exactly 8 o'clock, things change. I am bringing federal investigators and military lawyers into this. You need to call the best real estate attorney you can find the second you wake up, because this entire transaction is going to be legally ripped apart." Claire nodded silently, standing up and wrapping her arms tightly around herself. She thanked me quietly, her voice trembling, and walked back inside, locking the heavy wooden door behind her. I stood alone on the porch for a minute, listening to the deadbolt click into place on my own home. I grabbed my heavy military duffel bag from the driveway, called another taxi, and headed straight to the naval base. I didn't sleep a single minute that night. I sat on the edge of a cheap, stiff mattress in the base transit barracks, drinking terrible instant coffee and pulling up every single financial record I could access on my laptop. By the time the California sun came up, I was already standing outside the base legal office, waiting for my JAG attorney to arrive. When Major Davis walked in, he took one look at my face and immediately unlocked his office door. I spent the next 3 hours sitting across from him and 2 federal agents from the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General. Because my mortgage was backed by the federal government through a VA loan, the fraud my father committed wasn't just a messy state-level crime. It was a direct, targeted attack on a federal institution that I laid everything out on the table. The forged digital signatures, the offshore routing numbers I had flagged from Qatar, and the exact timeline of the 72-hour cash sale. The federal agents took meticulous notes. Your father didn't just forge a signature. The lead federal agent, a stern-looking woman named Agent Harris, explained to me. He had to bypass the title company's stringent verification process. To do that in 3 days, he needed an inside man. Arthur Blake didn't just act as a broker. He acted as the fraudulent notary and the fake escrow officer. He completely bypassed the mandatory waiting periods and wired the buyers cash directly into a shell account instead of a legally bonded escrow account. Where is the money now? I asked, leaning forward. Claire paid $850,000 in cash. She needs that money back immediately, and I need the deed to my house cleared. The money didn't stay in the shell account for more than 10 minutes, Agent Harris stated, pulling up a printed bank ledger and sliding it across the desk to me. Arthur Blake immediately divided the funds. He took a massive 20% cut for himself as a facilitation fee and wired it to a private account in the Cayman Islands. The rest of the money was transferred in 4 separate batches to an offshore holding company linked directly to the underground gambling syndicate your brother owes. Hearing the exact details made my stomach twist violently. Dominic's mess was so much bigger than just a few bad sports bets. He was actively funding organized crime, and my father had financed it using my military benefits. What about Arthur Blake? Major Davis asked the agents. The local police said he disappeared yesterday. He ran, but he didn't run far enough, Agent Harris said, a sharp, highly satisfied edge to her voice. Local law enforcement found his luxury SUV abandoned at the San Isidro border crossing at 4 o'clock this morning. He tried to cross into Mexico on foot to avoid automatic license plate scanners. But because we flagged his passport and his name in the federal database late last night, Border Patrol agents detained him before he could even reach the checkpoint. Arthur Blake is currently sitting in federal custody in a holding cell in downtown San Diego. He is facing decades in federal prison for wire fraud, bank fraud, and massive money laundering. That was one massive piece of the puzzle solved. With Blake securely in custody, the fake escrow and the forged paperwork would be incredibly easy to prove in a court of law. But the money he had already wired to the gambling syndicate was a completely different story. And my family? I asked, keeping my tone strictly professional. I refused to show any emotional weakness in front of these federal agents. What is their current status? Agent Harris looked at me carefully, clearly trying to gauge how I would react to seeing my own blood prosecuted. Victor and Dominic Reyes are currently being held at the county jail without bail. They will be formally arraigned this afternoon. Your father is being charged with federal identity theft and bank fraud. Your brother is being charged as a co-conspirator in the wire fraud scheme. Good, I said without a single second of hesitation. Prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. Major Davis raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. He knew my service record. He knew I didn't tolerate rule breakers, let alone family members who actively targeted my livelihood. "There is one massive complication regarding your brother," Agent Harris continued, her expression darkening slightly. "Dominic is terrified, and he has every right to be. We monitored his allowed phone call from the jail this morning. He didn't call a defense lawyer. He called a burner phone number linked directly to the syndicate. He tried to tell them the money had been sent, but the syndicate already knows the federal government is now tracking those specific offshore accounts. The money your father stole from the house sale is now mathematically toxic. The syndicate can't touch it without triggering massive federal money laundering alarms." I sat back in my chair, fully realizing the absolute disaster Dominic had created. So the syndicate didn't actually get paid. "Exactly," Agent Harris nodded grimly. "The money is frozen in a digital standoff, which means Dominic's debt is not settled. The people he owes are highly dangerous, and they are extremely angry that federal agents are now looking directly at their financial networks because of his sloppy family real estate scam. He isn't just facing prison time now, he is facing a very real, very credible threat to his life, even inside the county jail. My father had sold my house, ruined an innocent stranger's life, and committed multiple federal felonies, all to save Dominic from the mafia. And in the end, his desperate, highly illegal plan had actually made everything 10 times worse. He had put a massive federal spotlight directly onto the syndicate, guaranteeing that they would never, ever forgive Dominic's massive debt. "I need my house back," I told the agents, steering the conversation entirely away from Dominic's self-inflicted mafia problems and back to my own survival. "How do we legally reverse the sale and get Claire her money back so she can leave my property?" "That is the next step," Major Davis said, opening a thick manila folder on his desk. Because Arthur Blake was a licensed real estate broker, his agency was required by state law to carry massive errors and omissions insurance, as well as a surety bond. Furthermore, the title company that rubber-stamped this 72-hour sale failed to do basic due diligence on your forged digital signature. They are completely liable. Major Davis handed me a pen and pushed a stack of legal documents toward me. "We are filing an emergency federal injunction to void the property deed transfer immediately. We are also filing a massive civil lawsuit against the title company and Arthur Blake's brokerage on behalf of both you and Claire Whitmore. The insurance companies will be forced to reimburse Claire's stolen cash, and a federal judge will strike the fraudulent deed from the county records, legally returning the house entirely to you." I took the pen and signed my real name, physically in blue ink on every single page. It felt incredibly good to actually sign my own name on documents regarding my own house. The legal gears were finally turning, and they were turning aggressively in my favor. "How long will it take?" I asked. "Weeks, maybe a couple of months for the insurance money to fully clear for Claire," Major Davis answered honestly. "But the injunction to void the deed will hit a federal judge's desk by tomorrow morning. You will officially own your house again before the weekend. But until Claire gets her money back, she physically has nowhere to go." I nodded slowly. I had to go back to the house today and face Claire again. We were two completely different strangers bound together by my family's massive crime, and we were going to have to figure out how to coexist in the exact same house while the federal government tore my father and brother's lives completely apart. I drove my rental car from the naval base back to my own street just before noon. The California sun was bright, and the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always did, completely peaceful and entirely indifferent to the massive federal crime that had taken place on my driveway just 24 hours ago. I parked by the curb, grabbed my heavy duffel bag out of the trunk, and walked up my own walkway. It felt incredibly strange to knock on my own front door, but I didn't have a key that fit the new locks yet. Claire opened the door after the second knock. She looked terrible. She was wearing the exact same oversized sweater from yesterday. Her hair was a mess, and her eyes were deeply bloodshot from crying all night. When she saw me standing there in my civilian clothes, she visibly tensed up, gripping the edge of the heavy wooden door. I didn't waste any time with small talk. I just spent the entire morning with federal agents and my military JAG attorney. We filed an emergency federal injunction an hour ago, and the fraudulent real estate transaction is going to be completely voided by a judge very soon. You are going to get your entire life savings back, plus additional legal compensation from the title company's insurance and the broker's surety bond. Claire stared at me, her mouth slightly open, processing the massive amount of legal information I had just dropped on her. Slowly, the immense tension in her shoulders began to drop. She let out a long, shaky breath and leaned against the doorframe. Are you serious? The insurance is actually going to pay me back. Yes, I told her directly. Arthur Blake was arrested early this morning by Border Patrol agents while trying to flee into Mexico. He is currently sitting in a federal holding cell, and his entire brokerage firm is being seized by the government right now. The paper trail is completely undeniable. You were scammed by a licensed professional using forged federal documents, which means his insurance policies are legally forced to make you whole. Claire wiped her eyes, nodding slowly. Thank God. But my lawyer told me on the phone this morning that insurance payouts can take several weeks, sometimes even a couple of months, to fully process. I can't afford a long-term hotel, Isabella. I put everything I owned into that cashier's check. I know, I said, stepping past her into the front hallway of my house. I looked around. The space was completely unrecognizable. My familiar furniture was gone, replaced by her modern, minimalist couches and rugs. My framed photos had been replaced by her artwork. The house smelled different. It didn't feel like my sanctuary anymore. It felt like a staged model home. You aren't going to a hotel, I told her, turning back to face her. You are going to stay right here in the guest bedroom until your insurance check clears the bank. I am moving back into the master bedroom today. We are going to share this house temporarily because neither of us has any other practical choice. Claire looked incredibly uncomfortable with the idea. Are you sure? I feel like I'm trespassing in your home every single second I stand here. You are a victim of my family, I replied bluntly. They used you just as much as they used me. Kicking you out onto the street while the federal government sorts out their mess doesn't fix anything. Just stay out of my way, and I will stay out of yours. When your money comes through, you pack your things and find a new place to live. Until then, we are just two strangers stuck in a really bad situation. She agreed immediately, clearly too exhausted and broke to argue with a free place to stay. I carried my duffel bag upstairs to the master bedroom. She had set up a completely different bed frame and mattress, but I didn't care. I threw my bag onto the floor, sat on the edge of the unfamiliar mattress, and finally let myself breathe. I was physically back inside my house, but the war was far from over. Later that afternoon, my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed an automated incoming number from the San Diego County Jail. I knew exactly who it was. I accepted the charges and pressed the phone to my ear. Isabella. My father's voice came through the receiver, sounding small, weak, and completely broken. The tough, authoritative tone he had used to control our family for decades was entirely gone. I'm here, I said, my voice completely flat and emotionless. They are moving me to a federal holding facility tomorrow morning, Victor stammered, his words rushing out in a desperate panic. My court-appointed lawyer said the federal prosecutors are not offering a plea deal. Because it was a VA loan, they are aggressively pursuing maximum penalties to make an example out of me. I am currently facing an active criminal investigation, and the lawyer said I am looking at serious prison time, not just probation. Isabella, you have to call them. You have to tell them we are working this out privately. I closed my eyes, rubbing the bridge of my nose. He still didn't get it. He honestly thought I could just call up the Department of Veterans Affairs and the FBI and tell them to ignore a massive, multi-level wire fraud operation just because we shared the same last name. I don't have that power, Dad, I told him plainly. And even if I did, I wouldn't do it. You forged my electronic signature on federal documents while I was deployed in a combat zone. You actively chose to steal my house and launder the money to protect a criminal. You made your bed, and now you are going to sleep in it. I did it for Dominic. Victor yelled through the phone, his voice cracking with raw desperation. I had to save your brother. And how exactly did that work out for him? I asked, cutting him off sharply. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When Victor finally spoke again, he was openly sobbing. He is in solitary confinement, my father whispered, the sound of total defeat dragging down every single word. Dominic is facing massive federal prosecution for the wire fraud conspiracy, but that isn't even the worst part. The syndicate knows the money was flagged by the feds. His underground debt is still completely unresolved, and the people he owes money to have members inside this jail. He is absolutely terrified, Isabella. They tried to get to him during breakfast this morning. He is begging the guards not to put him back in the general population. I listened to my father cry over the phone, and I realized with absolute clarity that his grand, illegal plan to save his golden child had been the exact thing that destroyed him. If Dominic had just faced the consequences of his gambling addiction weeks ago, he might have found a way to run or hide. Instead, my father forced the entire situation into the massive spotlight of a federal investigation. Now, Dominic was trapped inside a county jail cell, surrounded by the exact same criminals he owed money to, with absolutely nowhere to run. I can't help him, Dad, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the heavy reality of the situation. And I can't help you either. You both made your choices. Do not call this number again. I hung up the phone before he could say another word, and immediately blocked the jail's outgoing number. I tossed my phone onto the unfamiliar bed and walked over to the large window overlooking the backyard. The sun was starting to set over San Diego, casting a warm, golden light across the grass. I had my house back in theory, but the emotional cost of this victory was massive. My father was likely going to die in a federal prison. My brother was locked in a cage with people actively trying to kill him, and I was sharing my living space with a traumatized stranger. I stood there watching the sunset, knowing that the legal process over the next few weeks was going to be an exhausting, brutal grind. I had survived 15 years of military deployments, and now I had to survive the total destruction of my own family. The next 3 weeks were an absolute masterclass in uncomfortable silence and agonizing legal waiting. Claire and I lived in the exact same house, but we operated like two completely separate ghosts haunting the exact same property. I spent my days at the naval base, aggressively working with Major Davis and the federal prosecutors to solidify the massive fraud case against my own family. Claire spent her days aggressively refreshing her bank accounts and calling her lawyer, desperately waiting for the insurance companies to process her massive refund. We rarely spoke to each other. When we did, it was purely transactional and brief. But despite the intense, suffocating awkwardness of sharing a kitchen and a living space with a total stranger, there was a strange, unspoken solidarity between us. We were both massive casualties of my father's catastrophic, illegal choices. We were both just waiting for the massive legal gears of the federal government to finally turn and set us free. Finally, on a rainy Tuesday morning, my cell phone rang. It was Major Davis calling from his office at the JAG headquarters. I answered immediately, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't waste any time with small talk. The federal judge had officially reviewed our emergency injunction and slammed the gavel down hard. The fraudulent real estate transaction was completely and utterly voided by the court. The corrupt, forged deed was physically struck from the county land records, and my name was legally restored as the sole, rightful owner of the property. That same afternoon, Claire received the exact phone call she had been praying for since the nightmare began. The title company's massive errors and omissions insurance had finally capitulated under the sheer weight of the active federal investigation. They weren't just returning her initial cashier's check. They were legally forced to pay out a substantial financial settlement to cover her extreme emotional distress and the blatant, inexcusable failure of their professional due diligence. Claire was officially getting her money back. Plus a massive amount of extra compensation. I walked into the kitchen and found her leaning heavily against the granite counter, crying silent, heavy tears of pure relief. "It cleared," she whispered, holding up her phone with shaking hands to show me the massive banking deposit screen. "The money is actually in my account. I can finally leave this nightmare." "Pack your things," I told her, feeling a massive, suffocating weight finally lift off my own chest. "You survived this, Claire. Go find a real home." It took exactly 2 days for a professional moving company to completely clear out her modern furniture, her rugs, and her boxes. When the final moving truck pulled away from the curb, I stood alone in the dead center of my empty living room. The silence was incredibly loud. My house was completely bare, stripped all the way down to the original hardwood floors and the bare walls. I didn't have a couch, I didn't have a bed, and I didn't have a single piece of my own furniture left because it was all still sitting in a cheap storage unit on the east side of town. But it was finally legally mine again. The fraudulent transaction was declared completely void. But while my life was slowly, painfully putting itself back together, my family was rapidly being torn entirely apart by the ruthless efficiency of the federal justice system. The legal consequences for their actions were swift, brutal, and completely unforgiving. Arthur Blake didn't even attempt to fight the massive charges leveled against him. Once the Border Patrol agents caught him actively attempting to flee the country into Mexico, his expensive defense lawyers took one single look at the massive paper trail of forged federal documents and offshore wire transfers and immediately advised him to plead guilty. He was formally arrested and aggressively prosecuted by the federal government. The judge threw the absolute book at him, sentencing him to nearly 2 decades in a federal penitentiary for orchestrating the massive money laundering operation and destroying the lives of his clients. Dominic's situation, however, was infinitely worse. He was facing severe federal prosecution for his active role as a co-conspirator in the massive wire fraud scheme. But the impending federal prison sentence was actually the absolute least of his terrifying problems. Because the federal authorities had aggressively frozen the laundered cash in those offshore shell accounts before it could be fully dispersed to the right people, his massive gambling debt to the underground syndicate remained completely unresolved. The mafia didn't care about federal court injunctions, frozen assets, or family drama. They only cared that they hadn't been paid the money they were owed. Dominic was transferred to a high-security federal holding facility, constantly looking over his shoulder, knowing intimately that the syndicate had a massive reach and an incredibly long memory. His life was permanently destroyed, trapped in a concrete cage with a massive, deadly target painted directly on his back. And then there was Victor, my father, the man who had always demanded absolute respect and unwavering loyalty from everyone around him, was utterly and completely humiliated. He was no longer the tough, authoritative patriarch of the Reyes family who could bully his way out of any situation. He was just a broken, terrified old man facing an intense, massive criminal investigation for his direct actions. The federal prosecutors simply didn't care that he was desperately trying to save his son from a mob hit. They only cared that he had actively forged a United States military officer's digital signature to aggressively manipulate a federal VA loan. He was actively facing serious prison time, or at the very absolute least, a heavy suspended sentence that would completely ruin his remaining years and strip him of his dignity. He had permanently lost his freedom, his reputation, and his daughter, all in one single, catastrophic gamble that I didn't attend their formal arraignments. I didn't answer the desperate, pleading letters my father sent to my house from his holding cell. I completely and permanently severed all contact with both of them. They had made their horrific, unforgivable choices, and I was absolutely done paying the price for their mistakes. I had a house to rebuild, and I was going to do it completely alone. The morning after Claire finally moved out of my house, I woke up early in my temporary room at the naval base. I didn't put on my military uniform today. I put on a pair of old jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and my heavy work boots. I drank a terrible cup of black coffee from the barracks cafeteria, grabbed the keys to my rental car, and drove straight to a local truck rental place on the edge of town. I rented a 20-foot moving box truck and drove it to the cheap, dusty storage facility on the east side of San Diego where my father had carelessly dumped my entire life. When I rolled up the metal door of the storage unit, the harsh morning sunlight illuminated a massive pile of cardboard boxes, my disassembled bed frame, my living room couch, and all the personal items I had worked so hard to buy over the last 15 years. Seeing it all shoved into a dirty concrete box was a physical reminder of exactly what my family thought of me. They viewed my life, my achievements, and my property as completely disposable. I didn't hire a moving crew to help me. I didn't ask any of my friends from the base. I needed to do this completely alone. For the next 6 hours, I carried every single heavy box, every piece of wooden furniture, and every bag of clothes out of that unit and loaded it into the back of the rented truck. My muscles burned, my hands were scraped, and my shirt was completely soaked in sweat. But I didn't stop until the concrete unit was completely emptied that I drove the heavy truck back to my quiet, upscale, coastal neighborhood. The street was incredibly peaceful. The California ocean breeze was blowing gently through the palm trees, and everything looked completely normal from the outside. I backed the truck into my driveway, the exact same driveway where my father had crossed his arms and told me I didn't live there anymore just a few weeks ago. I unlocked the front door with my brand new set of keys and began the exhausting process of carrying my entire life back inside. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my cell phone rang. I set down a heavy box of kitchen plates on the granite counter and answered it. It was Major Davis from the JAG office calling to give me the absolute final update on the legal fallout. Captain Reyes, I just received the finalized paperwork from the federal prosecutor's office and the county clerk, Major Davis said, his voice carrying a tone of absolute finality. The fraudulent transaction was completely declared void. Your name is the only name on that property deed, and the title company has completely locked down the security of your file, so no one can ever attempt a digital transfer without your physical presence again. Thank you, Major, I replied, leaning heavily against the kitchen counter and wiping the sweat off my forehead. What is the final status on the buyer? Claire was refunded her money and received her legal compensation. The insurance payout cleared completely yesterday morning, and she has officially retained a new, heavily vetted real estate agent to help her find a legitimate property. I nodded to myself, feeling a genuine sense of relief for her. She was collateral damage in my family's war, and I was glad she had made it out relatively intact. But I knew the rest of the updates weren't going to be nearly as positive. I asked Major Davis to give me the final rundown on the people who actually caused this nightmare. Arthur Blake was formally arrested. He pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud and money laundering charges yesterday afternoon to avoid a massive, drawn-out trial. He is currently being transferred to a federal penitentiary to begin serving a 19-year sentence. And my brother? I asked, my voice completely flat and devoid of any sisterly concern. Major Davis paused for a second, clearly reading the grim notes on his desk. Dominic was now facing federal prosecution, and his massive underground debt remained completely unresolved. The federal government has permanently seized the offshore accounts holding the laundered money from your house sale. Because the criminal syndicate never actually received their cash, they consider his debt completely active. He was denied bail due to his direct flight risk and his active connections to organized crime. He is currently sitting in a high-security lockdown unit because the prison guards intercepted a credible threat against his life from other inmates connected to the syndicate. He is looking at 5 to 8 years in federal prison for the fraud, but honestly, his lawyers are more worried about keeping him alive until the trial. I didn't feel a single ounce of pity. Dominic had spent 42 years making incredibly selfish, destructive choices, and he always expected someone else to jump in and save him at the very last second. He finally ran out of people to use. What about Victor? I asked, using my father's first name because he had completely lost the right to the title of dad. Victor was the target of an active criminal investigation and faced the very real possibility of a suspended sentence or direct prison time because of his advanced age and his lack of prior criminal history. His public defender is aggressively lobbying the federal judge for leniency. They are trying to argue that he acted under extreme duress because the mafia was threatening his son. However, the federal prosecutors are pushing back hard because he actively forged federal VA loan documents to execute the crime. The current plea deal on the table is 5 years of federal probation, massive financial restitution, and a permanent felony record. But if the judge rejects it next week, he will absolutely go to federal prison for at least 2 years. Let the judge do whatever the judge wants to do, I told Major Davis. I am not writing a character reference letter for him. I am not speaking at his sentencing hearing. I have permanently blocked their phone numbers, and I have instructed the base security gates to instantly deny them entry if they ever try to find me. As far as I am concerned, I do not have a father or a brother anymore. Major Davis understood completely. We wrapped up the phone call, and I put my phone back into my pocket that I spent the rest of the evening unpacking boxes. I set up my bed frame in the master bedroom, put my clothes back into the exact same closets they had been dragged out of, and arranged my living room furniture exactly the way I liked it. By the time the sun fully set over the Pacific Ocean, the house looked exactly the way it did before I left for my deployment in Qatar 8 months ago. Everything was physically back in its proper place. I finally returned to the house to stay. I walked down the stairs and stood in the center of the living room, looking around at the familiar walls, the hardwood floors, and the large windows facing the street. I had won the legal battle. I had successfully defeated the massive fraud scheme, protected my federal assets, and forced the people who betrayed me to face severe, life-altering consequences. But I quickly realized it was not the old house anymore. The innocence of this place was completely gone. Every time I looked at the front door, I would remember the exact moment my father stood on the driveway and coldly told me I didn't live here anymore. Every time I looked at the porch, I would remember the terrifying, pathetic look on Dominic's face as he actively tried to justify stealing my sanctuary to pay off his gambling debts. The people who were supposed to love me and protect me had actively chosen to throw me to the wolves just to save themselves. The deep, agonizing stain of their ultimate betrayal was permanently soaked into the floorboards of this house that I didn't turn on the lights. I just stood there in the quiet, fading evening shadows, feeling the massive, heavy weight of the last few weeks slowly settling into my bones. I had spent 15 years of my life deploying to active war zones, dodging actual mortar fire, and surviving in some of the most dangerous, unforgiving environments on the planet. I always thought the real danger was overseas. I never expected the greatest threat to my survival to be waiting for me right on my own front porch. I took a deep, slow breath, letting the cool coastal air fill my lungs. I looked around the quiet, empty room one last time that I stood right in the middle of the room and said out loud, "Home isn't what you keep, it's what you survive." It was absolutely not a complete victory. I had permanently lost my entire family. I had endured massive psychological stress, and my safe haven had been brutally violated. I would carry the scars of this betrayal for the absolute rest of my life. But it was the definitive moment of taking back control of my life. They tried to break me, they tried to use my strength against me, and they failed completely. I was still standing. I still owned my home. And tomorrow morning, I would wake up, put my military uniform back on, and continue moving forward entirely on my own terms.